So in this dekulakization process, is, like I said, it's a full-scale attack against the peasantry in Russia. Remember, during the Civil War, they were they had lost control of the countryside, and so this is Stalin's path to gain control by breaking the soul of the Russian peasant. Part of this is also gaining grain, as much grain as they can get, to sell off to Western governments. They can sell it to the West, they can gain foreign currency to then buy equipment for this industrialization process, which is more important to Stalin's goals. That's the number one goal, really, of Stalin, to industrialize. This is the only way he feels he could ever fight the West. One of these, in this process of dekulakization, of removing the peasants, of attacking the kulaks, is a grain crisis that happens in 1932 and 1933 in the Ukraine, which is considered the breadbasket of Russia. And this is under great contention today as to what happened. But there was a famine that occurred in this region and in other areas of Russia as well. And some evidence points that this was done through bureaucratic mishandling of grain. Grain was taken from this area in hopes of selling it to the West, but it was too much, and they didn't then have enough to feed the people. And in terms of redistributing grain and such, that didn't seem to work out, and millions died. There are those who believe that this was genocide against the Ukrainian people in particular. And this is called the Holodomor, and some people call this the Ukrainian Holocaust, that this was a direct attack against Ukrainians, and in terms of a genocide against Ukrainians. There are two great opinions on this. Robert Conquest, who represents the Orthodox approach to this, and he has certain evidence that he feels that it was genocide. Mark Tauger, Dr. Mark Tauger, who's at WVU, has another approach to this, and he believes that it was not a genocide. Genocide is an attack on a particular group of people for their own ethnicity alone. Dr. Tauger argues that if you look at the evidence, millions were dying in other regions as well. So it's not just directly attacked at the Ukrainian people. And this is something the U.S. Congress has even been debating. There are those who have pushed forth to declare that the 1932-33 artificial famine, or forced famine as it's sometimes called, man-made famine, was an act of genocide. You can look at the evidence. You could read Robert Conquest's book on this called Harvest of Sorrow. You might be interested in reading Dr. Tauger's writings on this. I have a tendency to concur with Dr. Tauger on this, but you might have your own opinion. But regardless, 6 million people starved to death in 1932 to 1933 in the Ukraine. And like I said, millions might have died in other regions as well in Russia during the time period. There was famine, a great famine throughout Russia. 6 million people is a crazy large number of people dying. And the witnesses, you just basically see people, dying on the streets. There was some cannibalism. Basically, every little piece of grain was taken from the Ukrainian people during this famine, and people starved to death. There was nothing, absolutely nothing from grain requisitions that had happened. Where was the U.S. in this? Who was paying attention? No one, really. The West had received reports about the famine, but America was in the middle of the Great Depression, and what was happening in Russia was not big news. And this is really the case in Eastern Europe in many ways. And when Hitler gains power and ascendancy, and Stalin's doing these things in Russia, the West has closed its doors and closed its minds to what's happening in Eastern Europe. There's an inward-looking policy, and domestic policies concentrate on domestic issues, not seeing that they are part of a greater worldwide movement, and they're part of a worldwide economy. And you know, the famine that happens should be something that people study about, and should be something that people know more about, and it's slowly becoming a part of American textbooks. But again, it's a lot of it has been politicized by Ukrainian people today as that this was a direct attack against Ukrainians, and the political discussion of this has a lot to do with what goes on in Ukraine today. There's this large Russian population in Ukraine, and the current Ukrainian government is in continual fights with the Russian population within Ukraine versus Ukrainians. So some people see this has become a politicized issue. Like I said, you might want to read Dr. Tauger's writings on this to see a more moderate approach to what happened during that time period. Regardless, terrible, terrible number of deaths. This is part of this collectivization drive, however, and millions of peasants are sent to Siberia and sent to the Gulag during this time period. They're sent on trains, cattle cars. Again, you know, you think that these things weren't happening, but they were. They're sent on trains to the east, and oftentimes the train would stop in the middle of a snowy field and say, get off and build shelter. And they have nothing. They're building shelter with their bare hands. And trying to survive. And of course, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands are going to die in this process alone, just building the Gulag system. There are some great writings about what happened in that time period. One of the most famous is by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, called A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It's a very small book, and you can find it in many bookstores. And details his life. Solzhenitsyn was a writer who was condemned to the gulags, to Siberia, and it tells the story of the work that he did. Oftentimes they are sent to mines, and they, with very little implements, are worked to death in the mines. Sometimes they're sent to do forestry work in Siberia. It holds the great Siberia holds the great resources of wood for Russia. And so oftentimes it's they're in the forest cutting down frozen trees. And Siberia has inordinate changes of temperature and you know, some of the worst and harshest conditions in the world. And what happened in the gulags, again, it's known in the West, but it's not something that's studied that much. And maybe you've heard, you know, I'm send you to the gulag or Siberia or something like this, but that story too is not really heard in America. Part of your reading is with Nadezhda Mandelstam. She's a wife of a writer who's going to be condemned for writing a poem about Stalin. And that's her story about what happens and when they're sent in exile and such. And they're part of this greater story of Russia, of the terror enacted by Russia, by Stalin on the Russian people and the minority populations within this former Russian Empire. The Soviet Union had many ethnicities, 50 or so ethnicities, not just ethnic Russians. Part of Stalin's legacy, along with the Siberia and such, is in 1930s are what's called the Great Fear, and the Great Terror, and the Great Purge, and he's going to get rid of all of his political opponents. This is going to be called the Great Purge. So all those who had kind of been around during the October Revolution, almost universally, they're all going to be killed or imprisoned. He's going to enact fear on all party members, all upper levels of the party, to kind of clean house, because they might eventually want to try and take control. They know what has happened. Those who are in the know, he must get rid of. No man, no problem. Those people will be exiled to Siberia as well, or outright killed. There's going to be show trials in which very famous members of the party are going to be tortured into confessions, and there's going to be many people will be condemned for being fascists or Trotskyites or enemies of the people. And in 1930s Russia is a time of terror where you fear the knock on your door in the middle of the night that your husband or your loved one is dragged away and never to be seen again, sent off to the Siberia, or maybe you never find out whatever happened to them.